Why play Supreme Cells? Well, you might have a spot to reroll one of the units since there are a lot of low cost reroll units with Supreme Cells. You have strong AD items where you can play towards either Kai'Sa or Darius, or you have early copies of the scaling units that are required for a lot of the reroll lines with this particular trait. However, this trait is very dependent on opener. You're primarily playing reroll lines that have to scale, so you're often going to need to have those units early in order to properly play around them. Additionally, it can fall off pretty hard if you don't hit your units and items on tempo just to keep up with the scaling and getting kills and getting those stacks. Additionally, many of the high cap options are a little bit high risk. The Supreme Cell's core is very small, so it allows for a lot of flexibility in the auxiliary units that you're going to play to fill up the rest of your board. However, the ones that are usually the higher cap or considered to be the stronger ones are often higher risk, which can often put you in a bad spot and potentially bought for because of it. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. Normally I'm doing TFT related content such as this, where I am going through different traits or different aspects of the game and making daily guides. So if you like that style of content, make sure to like and subscribe, and also check out the VOD channel. It's in the description if you want to see gameplay, especially with some Kai'Sa games. I've posted quite a few. So what are Supreme Cells? Supreme Cells basically have this innate trait where the one unit of the Supreme Cells that does the most damage becomes quote-unquote Supreme. That unit that does the highest damage will gain additional damage amp and will also get an execute that will kill enemies under 10% HP. So the Supreme Cells, there's 4 of them: Kennen, Kai'Sa, Darius, and Akali, and the divisions are 2, 3, and 4 Supreme Cells, with the damage amp being given to all the Supreme Cells in the first section, and then the second section, that increased damage amp is going to be on the Supreme unit, the one that does the most damage, or the main carry for your comp. Additionally, when you get to 4 Supreme Cell, you will get a second Supreme, meaning that there will be 2 Supreme Cell units on your board that gain the additional bonus damage amp and also get the execute. So when should you be playing Supreme Cells? Well, a lot of it is based on opener. Good items that scale well with your units, particularly the AD lines, Kai'Sa and Darius, typically are going to be good options. So a lot of times if you're starting the game off with an IE and a Kai'Sa or an I and a Darius, it might be a good idea to play around the Supreme Cell line, since it is quite strong and pretty reliable. Additionally, there are many win condition Ornn artifacts, or many artifacts that work really well within the line for both front line and back line. So depending on what you get, if it's an artifact encounter as well, it can be a really strong indicator. And then of course, if you have a Supreme Cell emblem that allows you to hit that 4 threshold a little bit earlier, have some more flexibility with extra units, or if you're able to craft a Supreme Cell so you can put on another unit to be a secondary Supreme Cell carry, these are things that might make it a little bit more appetizing. Additionally, artifacts, reroll augments, there are a couple of Supreme Cell specific augments as well. These are things that can help you out, but a lot of times when you're playing Supreme Cell, you should be thinking along the lines of rerolling one of the units. Typically, Kai'Sa reroll is the main line currently that's played around these units. So a lot of times, you're looking for things that give you a really good reroll spot, either good items or decent rolling abilities to make sure that you hit your units on tempo. So let's go through the unit introductions right now. So of the 4 Supreme Cells, we have the 1 cost Kennen. Kennen has a stun, which is pretty nice. He works well in a couple of decent comps because of his protector synergy as well. And Sork, he's a triple trait. However, we're talking strictly as Supreme Cell. Kennen isn't usually going to be one of the primary carries. There is a Kennen hero augment, but that's separate from this. Usually that's like played a little bit differently, like as a ramping up protector style of board. But one thing is really important to know is that Kennen does have a stun, which can make him pretty meaningful even on late game boards. Then we have Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa is the main unit that we're probably going to be talking about in this video. Supreme Cell and Duelist. Kai'Sa has an insane passive where kills grant 1% permanent attack damage. So the Kai'Sa will ramp up if you have this Kai'Sa early. Every kill that the Kai'Sa gets will make her stronger and stronger, and at some points you reach a critical mass where the Kai'Sa becomes absolutely absurd in the amount of AD scaling that you get. Additionally, in their active trait, Kai'Sa fires a bunch of missiles that are divided between some nearby enemies, so there's a little bit of an AoE effect on the active as well, which works really well with their kit of having like that big amount of attack damage. We'll talk a lot about Kai'Sa in this video, so this is where a lot of the focus will be. There's also Darius. Darius has a tank busting kind of effect. He heals and does damage, and he has increased damage against tanks, so he's really good at like chewing through some really tough front lines. But additionally, if he kills an enemy, then he will recast, which will do an additional bout of damage. So what works really nicely with Darius is that he'll kill a unit, then reset, kill a unit, and he can do this jumping effect where he basically gets multi-kills off rip and kind of clears a whole board, especially if you're going against weaker boards that aren't upgraded. This is a huge benefit. Next, we also have Akali. So Akali used to be really strong, and I think she will probably get a little bit of a buff. We'll talk a little bit about Akali in this video and some of the lines that used to work with her. But basically, Akali has this effect where she goes to the furthest unmarked target within 4 hexes. So she has really good backline access. Then she does a damage, and then every time she casts, she does more damage to everybody else. She got heavily nerfed, so she's not super reliable as a carry, but she is good as a secondary carry in some of these Supreme Cell lines if you can get to that point. So let's go through our final boards. So with the final boards, I'm going to show the main ones first, and then I'll talk about some of the variations and some of the other conditions to play some of the other Supreme Cell lines. The high cap, really strong version of Supreme Cells that you usually think of is Kai'Sa Rammus reroll. So what do I mean by Kai'Sa Rammus reroll? Basically, Kai'Sa is an infinitely scaling AD unit. So she works really well as a reroll line if you hit a Kai'Sa early. So a lot of times if you start the game off, you get dropped a Kai'Sa, and you have decent items to put on the Kai'Sa, it's usually a Kai'Sa game, especially in the current landscape of the meta. If you see a reroll line that you can possibly top 4 with, a lot of times it's a good option because you might be contesting some other lines otherwise because the 4 costs are a little bit awkward. The other unit that also scales as a frontline unit is Rammus. So if you pair an infinitely scaling backline unit with an infinitely scaling frontline unit, you have a board that can essentially outcap anything. Like, not technically anything, of course, there'll always be stronger boards that you can tempo with, and of course, but given an infinite amount of time or given a really long game, at one point this Rammus will scale his armor and MR to a point where he'll become unkillable, and your Kai'Sa will scale her AD to a point where she's just one-tapping units and doing an absolute absurd amount of damage. So this is considered to be one of the more high cap variations. However, because it requires 2 scaling units, you need to have those units early. There are other variations of Kai'Sa reroll, which we'll talk about as well, but for now I just want to go through this line. Then, in order to get Duelist in, you can often play the Udyr for Duelist Juggernaut synergy. Aatrox ties everything together with Juggernaut Heavyweight, which works well for Darius, as well as the other Supreme Cells. Whenever you're playing this, Force Supreme Cell is extremely powerful because not only do you get a second Supreme, which may or may not be impactful depending on what your items are and what your situation is with the reroll line, the amount of damage amp that you get is absolutely absurd. It's around a 20% buff from 3 Supreme Cell to 4 Supreme Cell, and especially if you're playing 2 Supreme Cell, you're getting like a 38% damage amp buff. This damage amp is extremely massive on your Kai'Sa, so even if you're not making use of the second Supreme, you almost always want to play around 4 Supreme Cell with this particular style of variation. Now, if we look at Kai'Sa and we're trying to think about items, you can actually logically deduce a lot of the Kai'Sa items, but there are some flexible options, which I'll talk about here as well. With Kai'Sa, she scales her AD infinitely. She is a duelist, which means that she gets a bunch of attack speed. So she has AD, base AD, attack damage. She has attack speed, AS, duelist, from her trait. Supreme Cell, especially if you get to 4 Supreme Cell, gives an insane amount of damage amp. So now you have a massive amount of damage amp as well. So what's left? Well, the only thing that's left is to make sure that her ult crits, because if you're trying to scale up her damage, the ways to scale it up is base stats, damage amp, crit, and then also attack speed to make sure that she's like getting those auto attacks off and getting those casts off. So the most important item that you're usually going to prioritize on the Kai'Sa pretty obviously is IE, and I think a lot of people figure that out. Once you deal with IE, the rest of the items are a little bit more flexible, but you really want to have at least IE on the Kai'Sa. A lot of times pairing the IE with Strikers is pretty good. However, when you're playing 4 Supreme Cell, you have a lot of damage amp. Strikers gives you crit chance and also some extra damage amp. The damage amp is a little bit of diminishing returns, but it's still a good item pairing because the critical strike chance that you get makes it more likely for the ult to crit when Kai'Sa ults. You want to pair it with a glove item, and this is one of the better glove items. So usually you'll see IE Strikers as the go-to build. Now, in terms of the last item is actually pretty flexible. one of the safe options is Shojin. So Kaisa, she has a really long cast timing, so stuff like attack speed isn't that great with her, and she also has Duelist in already, so she has kind of like enough attack speed a lot of the time. So typically a Shojin works nicely just to make sure that she's getting repeated ults off and just bursting down opponents' front lines and back lines and everything. So Shojin actually works out pretty nicely, but this is like the safe option because Shojin just helps her to cast. It doesn't really scale up her damage all that well because it's not like, you know, the stats that Shojin gives isn't that massive or isn't that powerful. So what you might see a lot of Kaisas doing, especially if you're in like a really particularly good spot or high roll spot where you have a really strong front line that can support the Kaisa, you'll see like triple damage builds becoming a little bit more popular nowadays. Whenever you have a unit that scales their AD to such a large amount, usually just putting triple damage items and not making a casting item on them works out to be pretty good, just because their passive gives so much AD that they're going to do so much damage between their casts, like through their auto attacks, that it's often like pretty good just to have another damage item. So here I put the Giant Slayer just to give the extra damage amp against tanks so she doesn't get stuck on a tank, but of course you can swap this out for pretty much any damage item, and it should work around fine. Additionally, like if you really want to, your items, especially early game, you shouldn't dwell too much on what you're making. I've seen people do stuff like this early based on their item quality, just like, you know, Last Whisper, make sure you have the Sundering, and even something like a Guinsoo just to get some like more auto attacks off and just have her cast a little bit faster by means of increasing her attack speed. What's really important with Kaisa after the IE is just to make items that make sense with your build, like scale up the crit, scale up some of her stats in some meaningful way, because you want her to get the stats. You want her to get the stacks, excuse me. You want her to get those permanent AD damage buffs, and having multiple items on the unit is going to be way more impactful than just sitting around with your components on your bench and just hoping that they're going to work out eventually. If you don't like the items, late game you can move them on to somebody else. Just try and make your damage items and try and get this Kaisa to get the kills so that she gets her stack, so that you have a meaningful, you know, late game scenario. But anyways, this is the safe build that I would say if you're like beginner or starting out the game, you'll have good success with something like this, and it also uses some decent spread of components. In terms of your other units, if possible, with this line, you usually try to reroll for Darius 3 as well as Rammus 3. Darius 3 isn't that great on his own, but if you're playing 4 Supreme Cell and you have the Kaisa that's already scaling for much of the early game, a lot of times what you can do is roll on level 6 for Kaisa, then you can go to level 7 and then roll for Rammus and Darius on level 7, or if you're particularly a high roll and you have a lot of Kaisas already, you can just roll for this whole comp on level 7. For Protector, I just put in Cassante here. A lot of times your board will look like this on level 7, just 4 Supreme Cell and the Aatrox to tie together some of the synergies. In terms of Darius items, Darius you want to usually build similarly to Kaisa because he has a lot of damage amp from the Supreme Cell, so a lot of times you build him towards crit. So a lot of times you can go for something like IE Hodge +1, right? If you want to give him some survivability, and Edge of Night can also work. Darius will help the Kaisa to basically chew through a lot of those front lines. A lot of times Darius will do like one big ult. If he one-shots, he one-shots and resets. If he doesn't one-shot, he usually chunks down the tank to such a small amount of HP that the Kaisa just comes in with the spread missiles and then cleans up shop and kills off everybody anyways. So a lot of times with this line, you go for Darius 3 if you can. Of course, your primary carry is Kaisa, so go for Kaisa first and decide how high roll you are on what level you're going to roll on. Rammus, however, is pretty essential to go for, so usually you go for Rammus. Rammus gets a bunch of armor and MR, so I usually like to put some sort of mana item and HP item, so something like a Spirit Visage works really nicely. Get some mana gen so he gets those ults off. Rammus has some pretty obnoxious ults in terms of like getting some stuns and taunts and stuff like that to make sure that your other units aren't getting damaged, but additionally it gives him some survivability by just like recovering some HP with the Spirit Visage. But additionally, you can just build him for like full like Giga tank as well. You can even put some extra armor on him. It wouldn't even hurt. Just try and make him as tanky as possible with the components that you have. In terms of Akali, the old Akali build isn't that great anymore. Archangel, it used to be like Archangels. If you saw Akali in the past, this used to be the old Akali build. Archangel's Guinsoo Shojin. Basically, she had such a low mana threshold that she would basically chain cast and get her marks on all the units, and then the Archangels would scale up, and then she would just kill everything. If you're playing towards Akali as a secondary unit with the Kaisa, it's not super recommended, but of course if Akali gets buffed a little bit in the future, this might be something that's really relevant. Archangel is still pretty good, but a lot of times you would want to pair that sometimes with some more upfront attack speed instead of the scaling of Guinsoo. So I think even like a Nashor's might be a little bit better in some cases than that. But either way, you can also build her for some survivability and just like raw upfront damage. Things like Hodge JG, the same type of crit pairing, but in this case for melee and AP instead of like melee AD like the Darius. And this can make great use of the damage amp because you have base stats from Archangels, and then you have the crit from these two units. You have some these two items, excuse me, and then you also have survivability, and then you have the execute and damage amp from Supreme Cell, which works out pretty nicely. Now, the glorious part about Kaisa is that I'm kind of showing down these breakdowns. I'm saying you have a lot of flexible builds, you have a lot of options. The thing about the Kaisa is that you are very flexible because you have 4 primary units that you're basically playing for Supreme Cell, and you don't even need them all at once because as long as you have 2 Supreme Cell, you're still getting a good chunk of change of damage amp, and even 3 Supreme Cell, you're in a decent spot. Because of this, you have a lot of flexibility with the auxiliary units that you would want to play to support these units. Another variation besides the Rammus one, because the Rammus, obviously you need to hit a Rammus early. What if you don't have a Rammus early? Well, something else you can go for is Mentor with Kaisa. So this is very similar to a lot of the other Mentor boards. Basically, you're playing 4 Mentor, they all buff each other, and it makes your itemizations really efficient and really nice, because the Mentors just like work as like a unit of being like this really obnoxious front line. The Mentors all have like bonuses that they help each other, but they also have a lot of stuns, right? Yasuo, Kabuko, they just kind of are a little bit annoying to deal with a lot of the time, so it actually makes a very cohesive package that you can play around. When you're playing this line, it actually works nicely to go for Kaisa 3-star and the Kabuko 3-star. Kabuko 3 is pretty tanky, pretty hard to deal with, and then you also get heavyweight synergy because of the Darius that you're playing. So the Kabuko actually is fairly tanky and does quite a bit for the board. Additionally, Udyr, when you're playing for Mentor, gives anti-heal, which means that you don't have to prioritize or make anti-heal a lot of the time because you will get it through the Udyr Mentor upgraded bonus, which is really nice. Additionally, Yasuo is a little bit of a demon and a monster, so if you're stuck on a level like a lower level board, you can also try and go for some of these units as 3 stars. However, it's not really recommended to dwell too much on them because if you look at this board and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what's that? 8. So this comp's a little bit harder to fit in, and it's a lot more difficult to stabilize around because you have to hit, like, you know, you can drop some of the Supreme Cells, but with Mentor, if you have 1 Mentor in, it gives a bonus. If you have 4 Mentor in, it gives a bonus. But if you have 2 or 3 Mentor in, it doesn't give you a bonus. So a lot of times, you're going to be looking for a Rise, which is going to be really hard to find, especially if you're rolling on level 6 for Kaisa and Kabuko. But eventually, you just need to high roll a Rise, hit the Rise to get the 4 Mentor bonus. But then you also have to make it to level 8 in order to fit in your 4 Mentor 4 Supreme Cell, as opposed to this Rammus line where you can fit it in on level 7 pretty cleanly and have a decent chunk of front line and back line. With this board, it's a little bit harder to fit in to get all of your buffs and everything working. Either your Kabuko is going to suffer from not having enough Mentors, and then you don't get your Mentor bonuses, or you're not going to have the full stacks of the Supreme Cell, and you're going to be missing out on a lot of damage amp for your Kaisa. Either way, this comp is definitely really high cap as per most Mentor lines. You can even play towards Rise 2 as a carry because you have Executioner with the Akali. So if you have leftover AP items, you can even build towards like a standard Rise Giga damage build, and this Rise will actually do a substantial chunk of damage because of the 4 Mentor bonuses. However, like I said, this is a little bit more high roll, so a lot of times you want to play this from having a really good Kaisa spot, because you want to hit the Kaisa and ideally the Kabuko early, and then still have enough gold to level and roll and find the rest of the units in order to play your 4 Mentor 4 Supreme Cell max cap high cap board. As an alternative to both of these, right, if you see that you can't do either of these lines, because both of these are riskier high roll lines, I understand that they might lack some of the consistency, but they do also cap very high. Both these boards are Exodia, not Exodia, but very strong game winning style of boards. one of the common alternatives that you see when people are playing Kai'Sa is just fries in the bag Juggernaut. So in this case, what you're doing is you're going for Kai'Sa 3, and a lot of times you go for Mundo 3. In this case, you're not usually playing towards Darius or deep into the Supreme Cell board. Instead, you're just relying on having an impenetrable wall of a front line to just stall out as long as possible. And then, of course, if you have a Supreme Cell emblem, or if you can make it to high levels, like level 9 or something like that, you can add in the extra Supreme Cells. But in this case, you're just stable earlier. That's the idea. You get Duelist in with the Udyr. You can stabilize pretty easily around a level 7 or level 6 board, right? You still have to make it to level 8 if you want to get in Supreme Cell and the 6 Juggernaut. But a lot of times, you're going to be playing around, I'll just show you, like a lot of times, like your board on level 6 will be something like this, where it will be very, very stable. It will be 4 Juggernaut, usually with a Mundo 3, and then you'll also have the Kai'Sa and the Darius. Additionally, oops, I got rid of the wrong unit. Let me put him back. Aatrox. Additionally, what you could do is on level 8, if you have Mundo 3 and your front line is stable enough, you can actually go for the same idea of playing 4 Supreme Cell, and you can just play 4 Juggernaut instead. So you can drop like this, and then you can play 4 Supreme Cell on level 8 as well. Right? And this also caps very high, and if you're high roll enough that you can hit Darius 3 while you're rolling for the Mundo, this can also work out to be an extremely strong and powerful line. So just keep in mind, this one, it just doesn't cap as high. Mundo, with some nerfs, isn't as reliable as a tank. And, you know, if you can, you would rather have the Rammus that scales infinitely, or you would rather have the Mentors, because the Mentors are just hard to deal with all the stuns. This is a little bit of a lower cap version, but is a much more safe version. And it's also something that no matter how many Kai'Sas you see, like no matter how many of the other units you see, if you have a lot of Kai'Sas, you can always fall back on just playing this line, because it's pretty reliable and pretty safe, and you can just play around the Kai'Sa without having to worry about the specific conditions of high rolling the Mentor on this case, or hitting the Rammus early enough to scale the Rammus in this case. So this is just another alternative that you can look forward to or play around. Ideally, if you can hit the Darius 3, that would also be fine. That would also be really good, and then you can itemize the Darius as per usual. Okay, so next I just want to talk a little bit about another reroll line, which is playing around Darius. This one's a little bit specific and has particular circumstances. So Darius items, like we were showing before, would be very similar, usually with like the Hodge IE +1. With Darius as a primary carry, this is typically more of like a top 4 style of comp and not a win out comp. A lot of the other options that I was showing, they have really high win out potential, even these lower cap versions that aren't scaling as heavily or using mentors, because the Kai'Sa scales infinitely, right? The Kai'Sa per kill will get AD. At one point, this Kai'Sa will just be like bursting down everybody given enough time. If you're playing around Darius primary, you don't get that same benefit. However, it is pretty reliable if you have the particular circumstances, like you high roll a bunch of Dariuses. But typically what you're going for is Darius with the Jace. And when you play this line, a lot of times you're looking for a specific power up called Fusion Dance. So with Fusion Dance, you fuse with the nearest ally, gaining 45% of their health, attack damage, and ability power. So what you do is you go for Fusion Dance on the Darius, fuses with the Jace, gets an insane amount of HP, then also if Jace has any sort of AD or other stats, the Darius also gets it. With Heavyweight, the HP also scales him to do more AD damage, so that gives him an insane amount of base stats, and then you build a crit build on him with the damage amp of Supreme Cells. He's basically like a monster, and he can do a lot of damage. It's pretty awesome, it's pretty reliable. The problem is that it loses to a lot of comps that have really good scaling. Like, for example, like a Yuumi will just one-tap the Darius anyways, so if you put a lot of like stats and power into this Darius, you know, you might get stuck on a Leona, get bursted down by the Yuumi, and then you lose anyways. So it's not particularly the highest cap, but it's very strong from early tempo, because this Darius is a mid-game monster. When he's fighting against tanks that are lower HP or not particularly upgraded or strong, he's going to one-tap them. And that's going to allow him to recast and recast and recast, and he'll just chew through boards. So if you start the game off with like an early Darius, you can often tempo it with good items and just play around this line and secure like a solid like top 4, 3/4, maybe even a second if you have enough of an HP lead. That's usually where this line falls. Of course, in the future, I always like to put it to make the videos a little bit future proof. If you're watching this and it's like well into the future of the set, Darius might be absolutely broken and you might see him doing nasty stuff. Same thing applies if he's just a better unit, then obviously the conditions for this particular line are going to be a little bit better in that you can play more towards the actual units. Additionally, last thing I want to talk about was the old Akali line, just in case it ever becomes playable again. But basically, the old Akali line was basically just to play protectors with Akali, and she would just like infinitely scale as your protectors just stalled out as long as possible. This Akali unit is really good at like eventually doing damage, so if you give her like Archangel scaling and ability to like go on all of the units, that was the idea. This comp doesn't work well anymore because Akali got so nerfed in terms of her damage output that she can't really like clean up shop fast enough for the front line to sustain it. But just to keep it in mind, something that could work really well because she always de-aggros, and if you give her scaling, is like a lot of frontline with the Akali. But typically the Akali now kind of finds her place as a secondary carrier outlet for AP items in some of the other Supreme Cell lines. But it's just something to make note of if she becomes a dual carry that can kind of like play towards some melee lines like this. Also, Bronze for Life boards were really exciting. You used to play Akali with Cassante, and it was all out Cassante with Akali. Both of those lines are kind of a little bit worse. If it becomes meta again, I will make an all-out Cassante Akali like board kind of guide separate. I just never got around to it because it got nerfed, and then it's just not that good anymore, and it's very unreliable, especially with the fruit changes. It's really hard to like guarantee good fruits on all of your units, as well as hit the board, as well as be able to outcap some of the other options that are there. Finally, speaking of fruits, I just want to go back and talk about some of the power-ups. One of the good ones for Kai'Sa, I think, is Attack Expert, I believe. I forget which one it is, but basically like giving her extra AD and scaling her AD a little bit more, it actually works out to be quite a good amount of stats, so it works really well with her. But there are lots of really good options for the Kai'Sa as well, right? You also have what's it called? Bullet Hell. You have Bullet Hell where you fire extra projectiles. Kai'Sa has access to this one. It basically works out to be like 30% more damage, more or less. I think it rounds down now, so it's 25% more technically for Kai'Sa because she only shoots 2 more bullets, but it's still a substantial increase in damage. And she also has stuff like Bludgeoner that works really well, or Sky Piercer or anything like that, like stuff where she can apply shred or make use of like ignoring armor, because she does have a spread effect where she can hit a lot of backline units as well. Specifically with the Kai'Sa, you might want to position her on the same side as an enemy carry, just because of the AoE effect that she has where she's hitting nearby enemies. A lot of times you can snipe a backline carry if you're on the same side as the carry, so a lot of times bypassing armor as well is going to help her to chew through those front lines and back lines a little bit easier, from just doing like a little bit more optimal damage. In terms of Rammus, you have all the awesome tank ones. A lot of times like Unstoppable works really well with Rammus, and then Darius, we already talked about that you usually want Fusion Dance. Lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about Ornn artifacts. Just I didn't mention it before, Fishbones is extremely good on Kai'Sa. This is probably, she's one of the best holders of Fishbones. It basically doubles her range, and she targets random enemies, so she can easily snipe and kill a lot of the enemies that are all over the place, and backline carries as well, so she can often scam fights that way. Additionally, giving her damage amp or extra range by means of snipers is really good as an alternative item. She also works really well with Mana Zane, because she could basically just pump out a lot of ults very early in a fight and just like delete units very quickly, so that also works really well. These are the 3 main ones that you usually go for on Kai'Sa, and then additionally you also have some cool options for Darius, like Prowler's Claw, where you can just run around and kill some units. That works really well with him, as well as like some of the other more melee centric ones could also work with that line. Silver Dawn used to be a go-to Darius option as well, but Silver Dawn got nerfed so bad with the it's hard to say if it's good on him, so I wouldn't recommend it, because he just doesn't get his cast off fast enough, because without getting access to mana from getting hit, it kind of doesn't function correctly or well anymore, is what I would say. For early game, a lot of times with your early game, you're not really trying to play Supreme Cell unless you have a Kai'Sa. I think it's pretty obvious because we're playing reroll lines. So a lot of times you're playing around the early Kai'Sa and you're just trying to make enough of a front line to get stacked. So a lot of times you're playing something like this with a Malphite upgrade, and eventually you can switch over to Juggernauts when you can. But typically that's what you're looking for early game. It's just the early Kai'Sa. If you don't have an early Kai'Sa, sometimes you can even start off by angling Kai'Sa with an early Rammus, because the early Rammus can often give you a good option for pivoting into Kai'Sa later. I would say that your stage 2 stacks don't matter too much for this board, so you still have an option of maybe playing this board starting on stage 3. I personally wouldn't recommend it. I think Rammus, even if you start him scaling on stage 3, doesn't scale fast enough in my opinion to be meaningful. A lot of times what ends up happening is you might need to just like force yourself to take rare treat for Rammus, to give him the 15 monster trainer levels in order to keep him up to par with a lot of the other tanks later in the game. But in general, I feel like you want to have either one, or if you want to play this particular version with the Rammus and the Kai'Sa, you want to have them both on stage 2 at one point. Ideally with Kai'Sa, you could technically start playing her like starting stage 3, and just sack a couple of stats, because you're not going to get that many stacks on stage 2 anyways, because there's not that many units and stuff. But either way, even if you're playing Kai'Sa, one of the most important things is making sure she has some items to get some kills. If you have an early opener where you either have IE or Last Whisper or any sort of slammable item that you can make on this Kai'Sa that makes sense, I would do it just to make sure that she gets the maximum amount of stacks, and you can usually play a little bit from a lead instead of playing from behind, because then you're just never going to get the stacks, and then she'll just fall behind really fast. Anyways, what are our conditions for success? Early Kai'Sa and Rammus, obviously, to start scaling. If you're playing the Rammus line, if you're not playing the Rammus line, you're playing one of the other variations, then you just need the Kai'Sa. AD items are essential just to make sure that you have good Kai'Sa items. Ideally, you're starting the game off with an IE and a Kai'Sa, and then it's definitely a Kai'Sa game. A nice tempo Darius spot is also nothing to sneeze at. If you start the game off and you have a Darius 2, or you have like a Darius with like good Darius items, you can often do pretty well by just like angling towards the Darius line. It's not necessarily like broken. It's not going to net you like a net win all of the time, but it's going to be something that you can often get a okay top 4 with if your spot is good. Now obviously if it gets buffed in the future, the chances are that you'll play it a little bit more often. Like I said, you're only usually playing that as a tempo top 4 kind of line. Most of the time, if you're trying to angle Supreme Cells, you should be prioritizing Kai'Sa, but I just want to mention it just because it is something that sometimes exists. Additionally, you want to be strong early and mid game. The stacks start to matter, especially on stage 3. If you don't have a lot of AD stacks, at one point your Kai'Sa will just feel like she hits like a wet noodle, that she's just not very strong late game. So you want to make sure that you're strong early. You want to make sure that you have that mid game tempo, and then by the time you hit your Kai'Sa 3, she's going to be so powerful that you can actually just steamroll, and that's where you can play for those win out spots with the comp. Additionally, I just want to mention the comp is pretty flexible with the front line. We went through a couple variations, but also know that the riskier lines, the Rammus and the Mentor lines, while they are stronger and they cap higher, they are riskier. So be careful when you're committing towards those particular lines, just because, you know, if you struggle to find a Rise, your Mentor board is going to be pretty weak. You struggle to find Kabuko, that Mentor board is going to be weak. If you don't have the Rammus early enough and you try and put the Rammus in too late and you don't get enough stacks on the Rammus, then the Rammus is going to fall apart late game. It really comes together in obvious ways, and it really falls apart in obvious ways as well. So, you know, if you don't have a very obvious spot for any of those high cap versions, I personally would recommend angling towards Juggernauts, just because it's a little bit more safe and reliable for that LP gains. Additionally, early items on Kai'Sa. I can't stress enough, having an early Kai'Sa and having a good spot is one thing, but having a Kai'Sa with items early is insane. So if you can get like early item augments or anything that you can slam on the Kai'Sa, that's usually just a really good indicator of you being able to like scale well and be strong throughout all stages of the game. But anyways, thanks for watching. Hopefully that was nice and informative, and hopefully I went through the Supreme Cell reroll lines in a nice way. Ideally, if there's ever a change where Akali becomes a little bit more relevant in some of the other boards, I'll try and make a separate guide about it, because right now it just doesn't make sense. You basically should almost never be playing around primary carry Akali on the current patch, which is 15.3. But anyways, thanks for watching, have a great day, and see ya, bye bye.